All right, we're going to start with reading Scripture. And here's how I want to do this one today. This one is not the Lord's Prayer. Yeah, so not that one. Let's go with my slides on the sermon. Sorry, there was a change. So let me read this to you. This is from the book of Ezra. I proclaimed a fast so that we might humble ourselves before God and ask Him for a safe journey for us and our children with all our possessions. I was ashamed to ask the king for soldiers and horsemen to protect us from our enemies on the road, because we had told the king, the gracious hand of our God is on everyone who looks to Him, but His great anger is against all who forsake Him. So we fasted and petitioned our God about this, our need of protection, and He answered our prayer. So we're going to be in Ezra today, still talking about prayer, but a little different than what we had originally planned. Last week we finished the Lord's Prayer, and if you recall, some of the main ideas is prayer is more than just talking to God and more than just asking for stuff. That is a part of prayer, but that's not all of prayer. And kind of the big idea that we've put in place from the beginning, and we're going to carry that through to today, is this backdrop of our relationship with God that changes how we view prayer. That this is about our relationship with God. Last week we had finished with the idea, if you were here with us, we finished out the Lord's Prayer, and we were talking about one of the ways we described it as preemptive prayer, like praying ahead. We were looking at that phrase, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. And we talked about this part of prayer that is centered around spiritual protection, that reminds us that we're dependent on God for that. And remember, we quoted a number of things, but one of the hymns, that line from Come Thou Fount that says, prone to wander, Lord, I feel it, prone to leave the God I love. Like that's what this prayer, part of the Lord's Prayer is aimed at, is that sense of, like, I understand who I am. I understand my leaning. I understand my weaknesses. And so I'm praying ahead and asking for spiritual protection. And so the idea is we're praying ahead so that when the moment of temptation comes, it's not just sorting it out in a moment, like there it is, now what do I do? But it's been praying ahead to that moment and asking for God's protection and wisdom in that. And we're going to kind of carry that idea today as we step into Ezra's prayer here. And so all of our work with the Lord's Prayer, with prayer so far, has been in the New Testament, and specifically the Sermon on the Mount, and specifically what Jesus had to say about prayer. And today we're going to shift into the Old Testament as we wrap this up. And we're going to talk about prayer from Ezra and how prayer is this place to settle our confidence and trust in God. And so we're going to see that in the story of Ezra. Like, this is that place where we wrestle through to where we can say, God's got me. And sometimes we have to wrestle through to that place. We don't sometimes, given the circumstances, find ourselves immediately saying, you know what, God's got me. Sometimes we're there. And there are other times where we've got to kind of work to get there. Like, I know in my head God's got me, but my heart has some catching up to do in prayer here to believe that God's got me. And so there's a chance as we get into the book of Ezra that this may be somebody you don't know as much about. Like, Ezra doesn't have the name recognition, right, of Abraham and Moses, of Joseph, David, or Daniel. Like, you're like, yes, I know who they are and I know their story. Ezra, you're like, okay, I know he's got a book of the Bible, but I'm not sure I remember the story. And so here's what we're going to do. We're going to kind of unpack a little bit of the history around Ezra that's going to provide some context for the way he prayed and the way he stepped out of that prayer and into real life. So in the Ezra's day, the Israelites had been living for 70 years in captivity in Babylon. So if you remember, months ago, we were in the book of Daniel. That was that time of captivity in Babylon. So Ezra comes in at the end of that 70 years. And so they've been living as slaves in Babylon. They've been scattered all over the Babylonian Empire. And so this is basically for the Jewish people, like this was a low point in their history. Like this is where it felt like God had forgotten them or abandoned them or had left them to just be dispersed and dismantled. And so they've been carried off into captivity, and they had a promise, though, that this would not be forever, that there would be a time when they would be freed and delivered. Those promises came through the prophet Jeremiah. And so Ezra is a priest, and he is one of the Israelites who would lead people back from Babylon to Jerusalem. So he's part of the wave and the journey back. And so actually in the Old Testament, you've got the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. In fact, sometimes they're put together as kind of one story. And actually the book of Esther falls in that same time period of the coming back out of captivity. And so during this period, people are slowly heading back to Jerusalem at the end of the 70 years. And it actually happens in 3 waves. And so anybody remember the name Zerubbabel? It's just fun to say. But so in the 3 waves, Zerubbabel led the first wave back of people back home. Ezra led the second wave, and then you all know Nehemiah, who led that third wave. And so the coming home happens in these 3 waves under those 3 people. And so you know the story of Nehemiah, likely, like, oh yeah, he rebuilt the walls, right? They started rebuilding the cities. Well, Ezra is about rebuilding the temple. And so that came first, and then came the rebuilding of the walls. But the whole picture, while they're rebuilding temple and city, it's really about God rebuilding and restoring his people. That's the story. And so in this rebuilding process, it's this outward manifestation of the work that God is doing in rebuilding and restoring his people. So now back to Ezra. So Ezra, just before he led some of the Israelite backs to Jerusalem, they prayed this prayer that I just read to you. And it's an interesting prayer. We find it in Ezra chapter 8, and then obviously leading up to chapter 8, there's some stuff that we learn that leads up to that prayer, and that's what I want us to do this morning, is kind of unpack what led up to that prayer and the way they prayed, and what does that mean for us. So they're about to make a long journey home, and they're getting ready to head out, and on the journey out, this is the prayer they're praying, and there are 2 basic needs for their journey. And they're fundamental and important. The 2 basic needs are provision and protection. And that's what they're going to need for this journey. And so they approach these needs for provision and protection with fasting and prayer. Where we were going to go today, but we changed directions, and we'll come back to this sometime, is the idea of fasting. Because fasting is a good discipline to step into. It's very biblical. It's thoroughly covered. It's covered multiple times. Jesus talks about fasting and praying. So there are good reasons for us to come back to it. And there's a lot of believers who have never, ever done anything with fasting. And so it's something worth coming back to. But we're not going to touch on that today. We're going to go a different direction. But fasting was part of what they did here. And so in the verses we read this morning, we're told that they fasted and prayed for God's protection. So when you're talking about fasting or praying for God's protection, think of this like in the simplest terms. If you've ever gone on a road trip, and the phrase we used to use, or that I used to hear my parents say growing up, is, we're praying for traveling mercies. Anybody? Yeah. So that's kind of the idea here, is traveling mercies, the kind of thing we would pray before a road trip or a vacation. And so asking for God's blessing and protection on that trip. And so that's kind of the prayer here, It's this prayer for traveling mercies or for safe journey. So here's what you need to know about their trip. As they head from Babylon back to Jerusalem, you're talking about a 900-mile trip. And that's like Cleveland to roughly Orlando is their journey. And of course, they're not booking flight tickets, and they're not even traveling in a car that can go 75 miles an hour. They're walking this. So this is a massive caravan of people traveling 900 miles over a period of months that they're going to make this journey. So, like, we're praying this before our, drive, like, Lord, give your mercy and your protection. So imagine setting out for a months-long journey. Like, that's a whole different way to ask for traveling mercies, right? Like, this is on a different level than what we're used to. And so here's what's happening for them. Like, we pack a couple duffel bags and we head off on vacation. They're packing everything they own. So this is a 900-mile journey with everything you own and everyone who matters to you. So to add extra anxiety and weight to all of that, it was well known that there were people who made a living robbing caravans like this as they traveled, because as you can imagine, a caravan like that has quite a bit of loot. And so there are those who watch for these caravans and take advantage to rob them. So hopefully you're starting to get the picture, like, oh, traveling mercies. I see what they're praying here. Like, so the essence of their prayer as they step into this is this safe journey. But it's like, not like, hey, it would be nice if we had your protection. Like, this is the prayer of, not sure what happens if we don't have your protection. That's the kind of prayer this is. So you've got this prayer for protection, but it's more than that. And we'll unpack it a little bit, but I would call it a prayer of radical trust is what we're looking at here. And in order for us to see the significance of this prayer and the radical trust that frames it, we need to fill in some of the story that leads up to the prayer that they prayed. So this all happens in the book of Ezra. And the book of Ezra is a really good picture of real life. And by that I mean the ups and downs that you experience in your life. And so in the book of Ezra, you get to see like the highs and the swings from like, wow, this is amazing. Look what God is doing. And there's this sense that God is at work. And then other times there's a sense of, oh my goodness, what are we going to do and where is God? And there's swings from both of those, which like we know something about that, right? You've got those times in your life where you're like, yes, look what God is doing. We call it blessing. And then you've got those other times like, where are you? And I could sure use you stepping in right now. And you've got those swings. And so Ezra has all of those. These swings of trusting God and questioning God. Like they're both there. This sense of confidence, God's got me, and fear. Like, I hope God's got me. That's what you get in Ezra. And so again, like we get that. We understand those kinds of struggles. So here's the background. This is a journey 70 years in the making. They've been in captivity for 70 years, right? And so the Babylonian army, if you recall when we were in Daniel, the Babylonian army comes in, they conquer the world. So it wasn't just the Israelites, it was the world. And they come in to Jerusalem, they knock down all the walls, they destroy the homes, they loot and burn, and then they carry off the people as additional loot, who would then be slaves and be indoctrinated in their land for the next 70 years. They intended longer than that, but that's not how history worked out for them. And so the going home story then for the Israelites begins with another conquering nation, the Assyrians, who are led by a king named King Cyrus. Anybody? They're like, oh yeah, Cyrus. Cyrus is a really interesting one, though. Here's the thing about King Cyrus. He conquers the Babylonians. So by conquering the Babylonians, it means you are now the ruler of the world, because the Babylonians were the ruler of the world. Well, King Cyrus, the Assyrians come in, conquer the Babylonians, so King Cyrus is now the ruler of the whole world. And within a year of conquering the Babylonians and taking charge of the world, King Cyrus says this. This is in verse 1 of Ezra. In the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord fulfilled the prophecy he had given through Jeremiah. He stirred in the heart of Cyrus to put this proclamation out in writing and send it through the kingdom. We're going to come back to that, but here's what I want you to notice right here. This is God's work. Like, this is the most powerful man in the world who God has just moved in his heart to make a proclamation that is going to favor God's people. You know how we sweat elections and things? Like, oh my goodness, what if? Like, most times when somebody comes in and conquers, it doesn't work out well for you if you're in the conquered category. But here's the conqueror, and God has moved in his heart to restore the Israelites and send them home. Like, this is crazy what is happening here. It's this odd proclamation because the Jews are conquered people. And by the way, they're not the only conquered people. They're one of many conquered peoples because the Babylonians conquered everybody. And so here's the Israelites who are one of the conquered peoples. And God has placed it on Cyrus's heart to favor these people. So listen, this is verse 2. This is the proclamation. This is what King Cyrus of Persia says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. I'm ruling everything. And he has appointed me, this is King Cyrus, to build him a temple in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. So any of you who are his people may go to Jerusalem in Judah to rebuild the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, who lives in Jerusalem. What? This is the ruler of the world saying, I feel like my job is to build a temple for your God. Like, I don't know if you're grasping like how wild this is. This is like an amazing, crazy move of God. Because here's King Cyrus, the ruler of the known world. And these people, these are his slaves. Like he gets all of these as slaves, which means this is a full workforce at his disposal. And he says, I believe God wants me to send this group of slaves back to rebuild their temple to worship their God. Like, that's crazy, right? That God would move in a king's heart like this. And so remember, the Jews, they're scattered all over the Babylonian Empire. And so King Cyrus issues this decree, wherever you are free to go, head home so you can rebuild your temple. Like, this is an unexpected plot twist for everybody, the Jews, the Assyrians, and every conquered people. Like, what? Why? And so there's another practical issue that comes into play here. The Jews have been slaves and prisoners, so they don't own much. And they don't have a lot of resources, so the king is going to help support them as they go. So he basically says, hey, by the way, I want everyone around them to give them everything they need for their journey and their cause. Does that sound familiar at all to anybody? Remember the story of the Exodus? And people gave them riches as they went. And so you've got kind of like this hyperlink, this replay here as they come out of slavery again and head back and enjoy the favor of everybody saying, well, let us give you what you need. And so here's King Cyrus saying, I want everybody to cooperate with these people to make their journey happen. And the king himself, Cyrus, gives generously to their cause of getting back home and rebuilding the temple. And so before they know it, they have been released to go back to Jerusalem for the task of rebuilding their temple where they can worship their God. And so everybody is now chipping in. All the ones who have made it back in this first wave, their second wave actually, are chipping in and trying to get this job done. And so when you read in Ezra chapters 2 and 3, this whole thing, like, this has to feel like a dream, right? Is this possibly true? Like that this foreign king has shown us such favor that he is sending us home to rebuild our temple to worship our God and helping fund the project and telling everybody else you should fund it too. Like, is this for real? Like, what are we missing? What's about to drop here? Like, this has to feel so strange. But they're heading back. So some of them are going home and they're settling in and they're beginning the process of rebuilding the temple. And they start by restoring and laying the foundation. And so when they complete the foundation, like, it's this surreal moment. And when we did the message on singing a new song, this is one of the places where they sing a new song when they finish the foundation of the temple. Because there's this sense of like, what in the world? We're about to rebuild the temple to worship our God. And so they finish the foundation, which feels like such an accomplishment given where they've been, that they're singing this new song. And so after about a year, they complete the foundation of this temple, and they're like, we're going to do this. We're going to rebuild this. Like, this is real. Like, there are those moments, right? As we've said, there's those moments where it feels like God's blessing is on us. And this is what it feels like to them. Like, they were in captivity, didn't feel like God's blessing was on them. But now they're heading home and they're rebuilding their temple and they're making legitimate progress. And it's like, it just feels like God's blessing is on us. So, like, they had a rough past, but now it looks good right now, right? And as they're working, like, this is the place where they can feel the momentum of God's movement. Like, the past was rough, but the future looks bright. And then you get to Ezra chapter 4. And now they begin to face opposition and discouragement. Ezra chapter 4. I'm going to try it. That's all right. So, then the local residents tried to discourage and frighten the people of Judah to keep them from their work. They bribed agents to work against them and to frustrate their plans. And this went on during the entire reign of King Cyrus of Persia and lasted until King Darius of Persia took the throne. So, started out really good, right? Like, we just laid the foundation in a year. We're going to do this. And then the opposition starts. And now it's getting hard. So now they're discouraged, and I highlighted the words for you so you could see what they're messing with. Like, there are people that are trying to discourage them, frighten them, bribing people to work against them, and doing everything they can to frustrate their plans. So if you had felt like you had God's blessing, what does it feel like right now? Okay, God, where are you? Like, because we laid this foundation, that was easy, and now look at us. This just got really hard. And so before they know it, 1 year to lay the foundation, 16 years have passed, and they've made little progress on anything more. In fact, most of them have just given up and have stopped trying to build. They're just going about their lives in the ruined city and just saying, well, I guess this is it. But Cyrus had it on his heart, God put it on his heart, send these people home. And what was the reason? To rebuild the temple so they could worship God. So they could reinstitute where God is at the center. And they stop the project. It got hard. And we get it, right? We understand how you can want to give up. Like, this is not, doesn't feel like we've got God's blessing anymore. This is hard. This is not what we signed up for. What we signed up for was the part where we had God's blessing and it all went good. This is not what we signed up for. All of this opposition. We've been here, right? Where you felt hopeful, where you felt God's wind at your back. You're like, yes, this is what I signed up for in following Christ. But it's not always like that, is it? So they've given up the project. God sends a couple of prophets to challenge his people to call them back to building the temple, getting them back to work. And so they slowly begin building again, and now it's under King Darius. So this is the one who Daniel had to serve under. So now they're under King Darius. There's some letters going back and forth like, hey, we need your permission, we need your blessing. And soon Darius gives the full go-ahead and full blessing for the building project. And so now they're back at it to see if they can complete this task that they started on. And again, there's some setbacks, but they're working on rebuilding the temple. And so now the second wave of Israelite comes. Now we're getting to Ezra. And here's what Ezra says at the outset of their journey to head back to help finish rebuilding this temple. I proclaimed a fast so that we might humble ourselves before God and ask him for a safe journey for us and our children with all of our possessions. So they're about to head out on a long, potentially dangerous journey. And they're asking for God's protection. That we know that there are people who have already been conspiring against all of this, even with the king's blessing. And so we're praying for your protection. Again, go back to the story of Esther that happened at the same time. If you remember the story of Esther, which is a fun one, like if you haven't read Esther in a while, just sit down and read Esther. That is just a great story. And so in the book of Esther, this whole drama unfolds. And you remember there's a guy named Haman, and he pulls off this plan to have every single Jew in the empire killed. And he's this close to making it happen. It is got a scheduled day, and there's a full plan in place to make it happen, but God intervenes. What you need to see, though, that's the kind of opposition they're up against. Like, not just we're going to frustrate you, but if we can, we're going to take you out. And so here's Ezra now about to make this trip. And you're like, yes, prayer of protection. You should pray that. You're going to need that. And so here's his prayer, protect our children, protect our possessions, protect us as we make this journey. But then Ezra goes on to say this. Basically, he felt funny, even ashamed, to ask the king for protection. And here's why. Because I had told the king about our awesome God. I had told the king that everyone who trusts him and looks to him enjoys his favor, and he looks out for them. And so after making that point to the king, he says it seemed odd then to say, we can count on God, but would you provide some protection just in case? This is how it felt to him. I just told him what our God is capable of, and so it seems odd then to come back and say, we could really use your protection. And by the way, this we would assume is a legitimate option on the table, or why bother mentioning it? And so they've got the king behind them. They've got his blessing. It seems like it would be nothing for Ezra to say, hey, obviously we're going to need some protection. And the king probably would think nothing of it. Of course you're going to need protection. Wouldn't see it probably as doubting God. But just yeah, there's another way I can help you. But for Ezra, this was the real issue. He had talked a talk of trusting God. He had talked about God's power. He had said in no uncertain terms, if you're looking to God and if God is for you, you're in good shape. You can trust him. He's big enough, he's strong enough, he's wise enough. You can be confident that God has got you. So Ezra's declared that with his mouth. He's spoken these words of truth, and now he's got this growing conviction that if he really believes this about God, shouldn't he just trust God for protection? Like, I know the king could protect me. I know he probably would. But I've declared that God is for us. Is that enough? He had talked a talk of trust. And now he was going to have to decide if he would walk a walk of trust. Talking and walking are not the same, are they? So in this case, the walk of trust is a 900-mile walk of trust, where they would have to trust God and God alone for protection, and again, don't enjoy the modern amenities that we have, that if you get 200 miles into your journey and say, you know what, we could use some protection, why don't you ring the king real quick and see if he'll send some? Like, that's not how this works. You set out without the protection, and that's how your journey is going to go. So this is an interesting place for them to find themselves, where like they've stepped out, and the only option now is to trust God. And here's what I want you to imagine as they step out. Like, we don't get to know exactly how that journey went. Here's what we know. God did protect them. They arrived safely. We don't know what happened along the way. If there were moments of doubt or discouragement, frustration, if they were like, do we still have God's blessing? But here's what we know, that they arrived safely. But what would it feel like on that journey to take those first steps and know we just waved off protection from the king? There would have to be, this is what I imagine, as you start that journey, there would have to be some sense of anticipation, some excitement. Do you know when you step out and like the excitement of trusting God, like when you've really let go, and there's that sense of, I am trusting him, and there's this anticipation, this excitement. But there can also be some questions. Like, can I trust God and have the king's protection? Like, that's possible, right? Like, are we sure that's the best thing to not ask for the king's help when we're pretty sure he's willing? I call this when you step out into the unknown and there's a whole bunch of what ifs and yeah buts, right? Like, you imagine all the what ifs. Well, what if this happens? What if this happens? And see, if you've got the king's protection, you're like, well, if somebody tries to attack us, guess what? The king provided some protection. So you've got some what if questions that you don't have an easy answer for. The answer is, well, we're assuming God's got us. And the yeah buts are like, well, yeah, God's got you. And you're like, yeah, but what if, right? And you keep circling around. And so you're stepping out in faith. You have to sort out some of the yeah buts and the what ifs. The option for taking the king's protection, it eliminates some of the yeah buts and what ifs, doesn't it? You can fill in that blank. I'll speak for me, not you. I like knowing I've got some options. I'm guessing you probably feel the same way. Like, if I felt like I've got the option to fully trust God and have the king's protection, that is a win-win, right? And here's why that feels like such a win. Because I have some measure of control. I asked that king for protection, and I can literally see that protection walking with me. So that's a win for me. There's this verse in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7, that says this: we walk by faith, not by sight. It's a great verse, right? But here's the reality. In real life, we prefer to walk by faith and sight. And if we have to choose between faith and sight, I mean, I know the church answer isn't faith, it isn't sight, but my real world answer is like, I want to go with what I can see. And so our gut instinct says, while Scripture says, and we would, we're in church, so we're going to say, yes, you walk by faith, not by sight. But in real life, at the very least, I want to walk by faith and sight. And it's a little bit of a dilemma if I have to choose between those. Now, sometimes in life, God takes us to places, right, where you're not really choosing to walk by faith or by sight. You don't have the option of walking by sight, so, I guess I'm walking by faith. Like in that moment, depending on myself isn't an option, and so I choose to trust God because I don't really have a choice. What else am I going to do? But there's a difference, right, between what Ezra did when he chose to walk by faith, but he had some options to walk by sight. You following me? He bypassed the option to walk by sight and said, I choose to walk by faith. There are the times when we're forced to walk by faith because that's all we've got. But I wonder what the places are in your life right now where you would say, I'm going to choose to walk by faith and not by sight. I'm going to believe that I can count on God with this place, situation, people, whatever it is, and I'm going to fully trust God. Not based on what I can pull off, manage, align, but just trusting God. Coming back to that idea that we talked about when we started in the Psalms, be still and know that I'm God. And we paraphrase it like this: stop it. Like, that's the be still part. Like, stop, let go, and trust that He is God. Yes, there are the times when you and I are going to have to trust God because we've got nothing else. But a lot of the time, our wrestling is, so what does it look like to choose to trust God when I've got other options? This is where Ezra comes in. Choosing to walk by faith and not by sight. There are those familiar verses in Proverbs, chapter 3, 5, and 6. Trust the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will direct your paths. Like, that's a great verse, right? Fits well on a coffee cup, on a banner, on a picture. Like it's awesome. But here's the rub in that verse. It's that second line. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and don't lean on your own understanding. Okay, so if I can kind of see what God is up to, trust is much easier. If I can kind of like trace the path, then okay, yeah, I'm going to trust God. But when I can't, oh, okay. So I just have to trust God. So this is where you don't have a choice. You just got to trust. So here's what I want us to see as we close this out in prayer. We have the option to trust God. One, because there's nothing else. So that's one scenario. But a lot of our scenarios are, I'm choosing to trust God though I have other options. See, when we talk about prayer and when we talk about dependence, this is what we start to wrestle through. And here's what I want you to see. We started with prayer saying the whole backdrop of this whole thing is your relationship with God. So let me ask you, is there anything more foundational and more intimate than you trusting someone? Let me ask it another way. If you struggle to trust someone, how well does that relationship go? It's an immediate fracture, right? So as we started this whole thing in prayer talking about this is about your relationship with God, we're ending with this foundational piece. Trust is essential to your relationship with God. That will be the places where you trust him when you don't have the option of leaning on your own understanding. And it will be the places where you will simply let go and choose to trust him, even though you could find some ways to lean on your understanding. You following me? But it all comes back to the relationship, because trust is the foundational piece in a relationship. So guess what? If you struggle to trust God, it should not surprise you that you would say, I don't feel real close to God. Should that be surprising? No, because trust is a foundational piece to a strong, intimate, viable relationship. And so as we close out this prayer series, I simply want to invite you to do this, to start leaning into that foundational piece of trust. Trusting that God is who he says he is, that he loves you and wants a relationship with you, that he knows, sees, and cares about the circumstances in your life. And as you bring those things to him, you keep laying this foundation of trust. I choose to trust. I choose to trust. I choose to trust. The thing about trust is it's so much easier for me to talk about your trust issues than to talk about my own, right? Because your trust issues, they don't have any real world implication for me, really. My trust issues, well, those play out every day. And so it's easy for us to look at somebody else and say, okay, so all you need to do is trust God. But it's a whole different thing to be the one saying, okay, so I have got to trust God. That's a challenging place to be sometimes, depending on what's going on in your life. Here's what I want to do. As we come